Okay, well, awesome. Thank you, everyone, for coming. A great turnout tonight. So my name is Kyle Robinson. I'm obviously a professor here at Olivet in the history department. And tonight we're going to hear from one of our history students, Bryson, about this special exhibit that he's put on for you as a part of our wider project, which is Material Studies in British Methodism. So we just want to tell you a little bit about that project, about this space, the Holiness Reading Room, and then we'll eventually have Bryson come up and give you his special talk about the nature of this exhibit, why these objects are actually in this case, and how we're trying to do history a little bit through an analysis of these remains of the past. So, Material Studies in British Methodism, what is that? Well, it's fundamentally a project of interpretation. And we take as the basis of our study the McGonigal Wesley collection held by Olivet, which Asher is going to tell you about here in a moment. And in so doing, it seeks to understand the objects manufactured by British potteries relating to the Methodist movement in a way that centers the history of the methods, men, and ministries connected to their production. Its central argument rests with the uniqueness of these objects within the wider story of British belief, social status, and industry. Unlike a traditional understanding of an icon, these Methodist objects were not objects of religious devotion. Instead, they were pieces of religious commemoration. They served to create and preserve identity-making memory for British Methodists. It was a process that began in the life of the founder of Methodism, John Wesley, who lived from 1703 to 1791, and continued into and across the reign of Queen Victoria in the 19th century. And of course, the reign of Queen Victoria is from 1837 to 1901. Further, the identity and memory making represented by these objects took place within a Victorian industrial context that saw an increasing sense of class consciousness among the working men of Britain. It was arguably first in the British potteries that an idea of mass manufacture and class identity formed. In the sale of desirable objects produced by these potteries, Britain also took its first step towards a consumer society. In the ongoing intertwining of these processes, the class consciousness and consumptive desire of Victorian Britain was inseparable from religious identity formation. Many of the workers in the potteries identified themselves as Methodists, and their chapels and fellow co-religionists purchased these objects. Thus, the production of Methodist objects manifested a consumer desire of commemoration within the mechanisms of an industrially defined social matrix of belief. In order to understand this matrix, our project, Material Studies in British Methodism, seeks to define, display, and digitize these objects. We are currently standing here in the Holiness Reading Room, which is where we conduct some of these special rotating exhibits here on display. There's also a more permanent collection of McGonigal objects, Wesley objects, actually in the front of the chapel. So the next time you're running late into chapel, you should turn around and look at the back of the building, and there's some several, actually I think over 70 or so objects in the front of the chapel that are also part of this collection. So a little bit about actually this space that we're in, because this is a space that's deliberately designed to foster research and provide a space for research in the Wesleyan holiness tradition. So as you look around you, you can see that in the back, there are several books that are actually available for you to use. What an idea in the library. Books that are available to use. You can also use these books here at the front, although they're much more rare books, and so you have to get like special permission, but you can even use these books too here, but they're, I believe, non-circulating. So this whole idea of a holiness reading room began actually out of the Holiness collection in 2011 as a collaborative initiative between Benner Library and the School of Theology and Christian Ministry. The collection was originally housed within the university archives. However, in 2023, a unique room, with this room right here, was specifically designated for these materials here in the lower level of Benner Library. While this collection continues to be developed and curated, Benner Library has currently cataloged over 1,400 items pertaining to the Wesleyan holiness movement in the United States and Canada, including formal theological texts and popular tracts. Collection development decisions are primarily guided by, although not limited by, the Charles Edward Jones 2005 bibliography, The Wesleyan Holiness Movement, a Commemorative Guide. And you can actually find that catalog, actually, if you follow one of the QR codes in the back of your program or exhibit guide for tonight. So, the goal of the Holiness Collection, and indeed the Holiness Reading Room, is to gather as many Wesleyan Holiness resources as possible and make them available to students and researchers who will value access to this rich range of holiness material. In order to not risk having certain materials lost to future readers and researchers, some items in the collection are kept right here in these locked bookshelf cases. In-house use for these items, of course, can be coordinated with the university archives. And we really like the idea of having our Wesley objects, like our objects of material culture that require a more explicit form of interpretation, to be, again, displayed on a rotating basis through special collections exhibits alongside all of these more permanent traditional forms of both historical and theological knowledge represented by books. There's a very cool interplay, we think, in this idea right here of the object and the text working together. And so that's a little bit about us as a project. I'm going to invite up one of the students who works in our project, Asher Kinney, to come and tell you a little more about Dr. McGonigal and give you some nice fast facts about the many objects we have here in our collection. So welcome up, Asher.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Asher Kinney. I'm a sophomore here at Olivet. I'm studying history with a minor in legal studies. I'm also one of the student project assistants for material studies in British Methodism. What we study in this project grew from the collection of Dr. Herbert B. McGonigal, and I want to tell you a little bit about him and how Olivet came to have his collection of objects. This collection was assembled by Dr. McGonigal, who is retired rector and senior lecturer in historical theology and Wesley studies at Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, England. He spent a lifetime collecting Wesleyan artifacts from shops and private collectors throughout Great Britain. He spent his weekends at car boot sales, antique stores, and private sales acquiring these items. His office at Nazarene Theological College was famous for the many ceramic items displayed on its shelves from his collection. This extensive assortment of artifacts offers a captivating journey into the world of Reverend John Wesley and subsequent Victorian Methodists, and were made throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in Great Britain. Connected as it is the Holiness movement, these ceramics bear witness to the theological heritage of Olivet Nazarene University. The acquisition of this collection by Olivet was made possible by the generosity of Mrs. Doris Cheeseman of Fort Recovery, Ohio in 2005, facilitating the shipment of these British objects from the Atlantic to Illinois. A permanent display of many of the McGonigal Wesley items is located in Olivet's Centennial Chapel here and also here in the Holiness Reading Room in Olivet's Benner Library. Material Studies and British Methodism hosts rotating scholarly exhibits of the collection like the one opening here tonight. And those fast facts is that there's 284 total objects in this collection. Most objects are pieces from Staffordshire pottery, primarily varieties of earthenware. And earthenware is fired below 2,190 degrees Fahrenheit and remains non-vitreous. Staffordshire is a region in the England Midlands that became a center of industrialized pottery production from the mid-18th century throughout the late 20th century. Most late 18th and 19th century pieces of Staffordshire pottery were fired in coal-fed bottled ovens. Oldest objects in our collection most likely dates from the 1790s and was produced after John Wesley's 1791 death. Newest objects date from the 1980s and are modern Methodist/Wesleyan commemorative objects. The vast majority of objects are Victorian in origin, though. Major types of objects include busts and statuettes, as well as various forms of plates, decorative plaques, teapots, teacups, creamers, pitchers, and loving cups. There are also framed objects, a spoon, a medallion, thimbles, and a button. In addition to Wesleyana, there is also a substantial collection of objects related to the 19th century primitive Methodist movement and John Wesley's followers, Thomas Coke and John Fletcher.
Thank you. And actually, here on our logo, right here, this is actually one of those bottle oven coal-fired kilns that Asher mentioned right here. This is the one at the former Gladstone Pottery Works in modern Stoke-on-Trent. And there's actually, it's a very interesting like piece of mechanics. You see there's like an outside rim and then an inner shell, and they heat with coal the inside, and then there's like the inner kilns where the objects themselves are actually fired. And sort of Stoke until the 1960s was covered with these bottle ovens, and they talked about like the Stoke smog because of all this like coal-fired pottery there. So it's alas, most of them have been torn down, but it's probably a lot better for the people who live there. That those ovens aren't there anymore. I'd like to now invite up Olivet alumnus Levi Berg, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we actually do, usually on Monday nights as a part of this project, and show you a little bit about how we gather this thing called metadata about all these objects. Oh, you should exit out my email so it doesn't beep. There you go. So there you go.
That's fair. All right. So, yes, as Dr. Robinson said, I graduated in spring of 2023. Immediately went into teaching middle school history over at Grace Christian in Kankakee. And I'm excited to be in front of you all tonight because I know at the very least I won't get interrupted with brain rot. Happens daily. So, what we do on Mondays, there's a couple things. But first, I just want to point you to right here. You'll notice if you look at the case later that each artifact has a collection number that goes with it. And basically how that works is there's no like rhyme or reason necessarily, it's just how they're brought over from England. And so, for example, this purple, we use colors to color code things. This purple is one of the ones that's on display in this case right now. You'll see that the collection number is 2005-015. Basically what that means is it was brought over in the year 2005. That's when it became part of our collection. It's the 15th artifact that was taken out of the box. And then if you were to go up to our archive lab, you would see, I say 16 boxes. Technically, those are broken down more. There's more than that. But 16 boxes, this would be in box 1B. So that's just an organizer for us to know where is this coming from, which artifact are we actually dealing with, because there are a few artifacts that, for example, you can see the teacups over here. Right? There are a few artifacts that look somewhat similar, and this just helps us keep our head straight to make sure that we're dealing with the right one. Next thing we have to do is name the artifact, whatever it may be. And we do kind of have to be a bit particular with that because, for example, what's the difference between a mug and a small jug? It's actually kind of similar. And so we have to be very particular about the word that we use to describe or name the artifact. So the teapot right there in the middle, this is this one, Primitive Methodist centenary teapot. We know because it is a centenary item, it's celebrating 100 years. And so it's 1907. Bryson will talk more about what happened in 1807 in the talk. E over here, this is the type of artifact it is. So you'll see we have it listed as a teapot, but in reality, we have a lot of teacups, a lot of plaques, a lot of plates, and so that's just telling us this is what it is. As we continue, we'll get more into what is it made out of, right? So the teapot, that's earthenware, and I'm not going to get into the nitty and gritty of earthenware and stoneware, but that's, again, that helps us keep our head straight, and again, this is supposed to be made public on the JSTOR page, and then eventually on our website at some point. So it just helps everyone else to be on the same page as us. Basically, there are two phases when we do work on Mondays, the observation phase and the research phase. So the observation phase is basically just looking at the object as it exists in our collection and going, this is what it says, this is what it looks like, this is the damage that it has, if any, and then we put that all down on the metadata sheet. And the research phase is the phase where we have to actually do the research, which can take, based on the artifact, anywhere from 15 minutes to an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how much we have for that specific object. Some of those we still do not have a lot of information for. But those are our two phases. So, and they kind of work together, right? So the observation phase is what we see, the research phase is how it got to be that way. And that culminates in basically all the artifacts you see up here and what is on this metadata sheet. And again, if we were to go to JSTOR, not everything has been completed. but these are the types of information that you would see on that page. So that's what we do on Mondays, and that's, again, eventually it'll be made public for everyone. But with that being said, I'll turn it over to the actual speaker for the night.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Bryson Doering. I am a senior history major here. I have personal focuses in museum studies and collections care. It has been a passion of mine ever since coming here at Olivet to focus on material history. Why do we preserve the objects of the past, and what meaning do they have to contribute to society? I would like to open us in a word of prayer real quick. God, thank you for a wonderful day today. Thank you for the season's changing. We're halfway through this semester. We were very happy that school is going along and everything is all good. I pray that you continue giving people opportunities to preserve the past, to understand history, to learn what it means to understand our past, where we come from, and our roots as people and societies. I thank you for everything that you do, and amen. So I started school here in fall of 2022, and it was soon after I came here that I got an email from Dr. Robinson saying, "You're a history major. Why? Let's go out for hot dogs." And so we went and got hot dogs. About a week later after that, we went to Boz Dogs right down the road, and he asked me, "Well, why are you interested in history? Why are you studying it?" And I expressed interest in material history and museums. And he was very excited that I said that, because that summer, if I'm right, is when you discovered all of these objects. Just before that, you learned of all these objects in fourth floor Weber, and you were like, well, we don't know much about them besides that they're related to British Methodism. And so you invited me to come along and work on them. And so this project has been building for the last almost 3.5 years that I've been working with this. And I thank you all for coming. I'd like to open us with my gallery statement. So, faith formed in clay exhibits the rise of primitive Methodism in 19th century Britain as reflected through its representation on pottery. It was an outgrowth of the Holiness movement shaped by the everyday lives of potters and laborers in Britain's industrial Midlands. An evolution within the Methodist theology advanced by John Wesley in 18th century. Primitive Methodism emerged from camp meetings, unauthorized lay preaching, and the conviction that faith should be accessible to all, regardless of class or background. The two pioneering leaders in the movement were Hugh Bourne and William Clowes, both of whom had a close connection to the pottery industry, and their images were memorialized on objects of pottery manufacture alongside early chapels and formative camp meeting sites. If you look at the two objects on the bottom on each side, the blue plates, you can see that there are William Clowes and Hugh Bourne portrayed on both of them, as well as some of these Mocop chapels on the rightmost piece. Bringing together objects commemorating and reflecting on the rise of primitive Methodism, Faith Formed in Clay emphasizes the close connections of the movement to the pottery industry and potters themselves. Presenting the portraits of Bourne and Clowes alongside the Mocop folly, the objects of this exhibit further reveal how a deliberate iconography of primitive Methodism emerged across the Victorian period, solidified by the centenary of the Mocop camp meeting in 1907. These objects here displayed show how primitive Methodism was not only a force for spiritual revival, but also a social force that reshaped working class life and identity. Like clay shaped by many hands, the faith they built was both resilient and enduring, grounded in the struggles of ordinary people, yet reaching towards lasting change to labor organization in Victorian Britain. So, as seen on your gallery guide, postcards, and the posters here, the first plate showcases Hugh Bourne and William Clowes. You can see this on the front of your gallery guides and these posters, or if you receive postcards in the mail. These are the three primary forces and focuses of this exhibit, as they are the foundations of primitive Methodism and the people whose actions defined what the movement stood for. Now, the primary person who brought about the primitive Methodist movement was Hugh Bourne, who this next object is a bust of. Hugh Bourne brought about much in his life. He grew up as a potter and wheelwright, and during his wheelwright work, he started to understand Christianity more, as he had many questions when he was younger. And through his understanding of Christianity, he started preaching, yet he was dissatisfied with the Wesleyan style of preaching as it felt restrictive. So, doing something that was unauthorized at the time, he took many people out to the Mocop Folly, which can be seen on the bottom of that plate. Now, at the Mocop Folly, they all gathered together, and it is said in the 1807 camp meeting that there were over 4,000 people in attendance, which is huge, because if you go on Google Maps, it's not big. So, through open-air preaching had been done by the Wesleyan in 18th century, the practice had fallen out of favor in early 19th century Wesleyan services, and this is why he's done so. Due to his radical choices, though, particularly his decision to hold the famous Mocop camp meeting, Bourne lost his ministerial license from the Wesleyan Church in June of 1808. Now, this plate in the middle is very interesting. It has almost the longest information portion of the gallery guide, because if you look in the reflection on the back, or not in the reflection, that's the last one. If you look directly in the middle of the plate, there are statistics relating to the Primitive Methodist Church for the 1907 camp meeting, or 1910 unification of the church. So these are one of the two plates in this exhibit displaying the statistics of Primitive Methodist Church. The other one is this bottom right-hand one. In between the figures, William Clowes, Hugh Bourne, the Mocop Folly, and the conference chapel where the Centenary Conference was held in 1907 are statistics of a century's work, which they took lots of pride in. Categories containing amounts of church membership, ministers, Sunday school attendees, and the value of the Primitive Methodist Church properties, which is interesting, as we will see later. Showcasing these statistics is an insight into the success of the church and its open-air revivalism. As a souvenir of the Primitive Methodist Connectional Centenary, this plate would be displayed in chapels to commemorate a productive 100 years, as well as a baseline for growth. Now, this next bust you can see up here is of William Clowes. He's the second primary founder of Primitive Methodism. And these are interesting as they are produced from the same firm, both Hugh Bourne and the William Clowes bust. They are produced from Hewitt and Ledbetter in Willow pottery. And this bust, of course, depicts William Clowes, and both busts were done with the intention of preserving the memory of the figures promoting the beginning of Primitive Methodism through open-air revival at Mocop. It was an event that caused a split in British Methodism, and the openness of the meeting caused much growth of the movement among working-class peoples, as they were the majority of people who went to the location. Like its counterpart, this object was made for mass production and consumption of people who wanted to demonstrate their adherence to Primitive Methodism in Victorian society. Yet this bust also holds further significant meaning to Primitive Methodists, giving Clowes personal connection to the industry that produced its very likeness. William Clowes, being born in Staffordshire on the 12th of March, 1780, to his father William Clowes and mother Anne Wedgwood, who is the descendant of the famous pottery industrialist Josiah Wedgwood. He grew up with a passion for the arts, practicing pottery, as well as aspiring to be the premier dancer in the kingdom. Clowes was converted on the 20th of January, 1805, and soon afterwards began a prayer meeting in his house and led a Wesleyan Methodist class. Like Bourne, Clowes also grew disaffected with official Methodist leadership and joined the Mocop camp meeting in 1807. Eventually, he gained his ministerial license in October of 1808, but his involvement with Hugh Bourne and his brother James Bourne meant that Clowes' quarterly ticket as a member of the society was withheld by the Wesleyan Methodists, effectively forcing him into Primitive Methodism. Now, this last plate you can see is again on all of your gallery guides and the posters and postcards, but it is slightly different than the green plate on its left. They do share many similarities, such as the ornate trim, albeit this one is blue, yet they are also, this one is slightly smaller, about an inch smaller, and it showcases way more floral decorative transferware. This could be either because the artist making it decided to put more floral decorative transferware, or it could be because on the back of it, it showcases a print of, that's not there. No, yeah, it is. It does not show a print of, I just flipped past it. There we go. Of Humphreys Park pottery in Tunstall, which the first plate came from. The first plate is interesting because it has 2 maker's marks on it. The second one only, this 5th item only has 1 of them, yet they're so identical. They both do share the W.H. Grinley & Co. pottery maker's mark on the back. The reason this 5th one does not have a second one is possibly because it was more than likely sold by W.H. Grinley & Co., while the first one was acquired by Humphrey and then sold later on, which is why it could have the second maker's mark. The main stylistic difference between these 2 plates is that this item is a blue decorative item, yet it also does have all of these roses that are listed on it. What does make it distinct are the green roses. So many similar items were produced for the 1907 celebration is not a coincidence. As recorded in the May 1st, 1907 edition of the Pottery Gazette, there was a high rate of production of primitive Methodist objects for the celebrations. The article says, the forthcoming celebration of the centenary of the Primitive Methodist Church has opened up an interesting field for the production of china and earthenware souvenirs of the occasion. The article also points out the close connection of primitive Methodism to the pottery industry itself, noting William Clowes, one of the recognized founders of the Primitive Methodist Church, was by trade a Burslem potter, and as the first chapel in the denomination was erected in Tunstall, it is not surprising to find the fact that several earthenware manufacturers are commemorating the celebration by placing on the market centenary ware, souvenirs ornamented with portraits of Hugh Bourne, William Clowes, views of Moe Cop, the Tunstall Chapel, and etc. Most of the objects on display correspond to this exact description and are likely the products of this massive production of centenary ware. These wares themselves further demonstrate the nexus of industrial production and Methodist adherence within the Staffordshire pottery towns. I'd like to point out, now that we have finished this row, that these objects are demonstrating the foundations of primitive Methodism. They all display not only the founders and the foundational location being Moe Cop, but they are the most profound objects in this display. On the second shelf, on the left is our first grouping. We have a Primitive Methodist tea service group. The 2 teacups alongside creamer are among many similar Primitive Methodist objects held in the McGonigal-Wesley collection. The 2 teacups here displayed are indicative of a replicated theme across many of these objects, commemoration of the movement's founders for its centenary celebrations. They all share the same transferware of Hugh Bourne and William Clowes, the founders of Primitive Methodism, with their simple golden trim and designs. They are typical of large production run for the 1907 celebration. Pointed to in the May 1907 edition of the Pottery Gazette, though recalling the forms of everyday objects. As special commemorative items, a tea set such as this was probably only meant for display or very special use. Given their everyday form, a commemorative set such as this would have likely been a cheaper form of commemoration than busts or larger plates, thus allowing people further down the social scale to signal participation in primitive Methodism and commemoration of 100 years of their church through acquisition of these objects. Now I come to object number 7, this Primitive Methodist centenary teapot, which Levi pointed out on our metadata sheet for us. This was also made in Staffordshire potteries in Staffordshire, England, although the maker themselves is unknown to us. Though not a part of the tea set displayed in the grouping of items for object 7, nonetheless, this teapot is also a commemorative object for the 1907 celebrations and continues the interplay between well-known domestic pottery form and commemorative item. Of unknown manufacture, it again replicates the 3 central founding images of Hugh Bourne, William Clowes, and the Moe Cop Folly, an item that remains central to popular connotations of Britishness to this day. This Primitive Methodist teapot makes an implicit argument about the relationship between primitive Methodists, primitive Methodists, and British identity in the late Victorian period, early 20th century. I'm just going to turn that off. And we come to the final object of this shelf. It is an Adams blue and white Primitive Methodist group. This grouping of blue jasper type ware miniatures are unique compared to other objects displayed in this exhibit. The small nature of these jugs and vases put them into a category of art pieces rather than practical household items that could be used on a day-to-day basis. The leftmost one depicts Hugh Bourne and its counterpart on the right depicts William Clowes. The tower vase that is located between the two again depicts William Clowes. Undoubtedly, a tower vase depicting Hughbourne was also produced, though this item is not held by our collection. The viewer should note that the date listed for the larger tower is 1910 as opposed to 1907 on the other two miniature vases or jugs. As a result, this means that this particular item was a commemorative piece for the formation of the Primitive Methodist Church or connection itself, which was formed in 1810. The depiction of Clowes is also a reminder that many of the early attendees at MoCOP and other gatherings were known as Clowesites, evidence of his instrumental early leadership. These atom items were produced in Tunstall. Even though these objects are from 1907 and 1910 respectively, they recall a much older style in the history of the pottery towns in British industrial production. The firm began in 1657, making it perhaps the earliest in the potteries, and from about 1755 to 1772, their works were actually leased to the famous Josiah Wedgwood. The Wedgwood connection is in fact quite important, as he was the most important popularizer of this style of pottery known as blue and white jasperware. Jasperware is an unglazed, fine-ground stoneware developed by Wedgwood in the late 1770s, showcasing a matte finish in a vibrant blue color. Adams used this technique and produced these objects in the style of Wedgwood jasperware. Linking the founders of primitive Methodism with the historic style in the potteries was yet another way in which Hughbourne and William Clowes were commemorated as icons of both British belief and British working men. Now to my favorite row. We start off with an object that has an exact identical copy on the opposite side, this primitive Methodist plate. Continuing this theme of foundation, this shelf contains three objects with identical transferware of Hughbourne, William Clowes, and the MoCOP Castle Folly. Built by Randall Wilbraham in 1754 near the border of Cheshire and Staffordshire, the MoCOP Castle Folly was designed to resemble medieval ruins, a popular landscape feature to construct in the 18th century. A folly has no other purpose than to serve as decoration. Its prominence in the landscape, though, made it the perfect location for Hughbourne and his brother James to hold the first camp meeting, as it was a well-known, identifiable landmark in the community. It also had the benefit of being close to the pottery towns. The MoCOP Castle was given to the National Trust of England in 1937. That same year, over 10,000 Methodists met on the hill to commemorate the 130th anniversary of the firm's Primitive Methodist camp meeting held there in 1807. My favorite object of this was something that we kind of pulled out of the box. In my freshman year, we were very surprised. There's a spider. So we were very surprised because it was an object. There was a box with only one object in it. We didn't know what it was, besides the fact we had a photo from 2005 that was very bad and crunchy. And so it's my favorite object. It's cool. It's big. As the largest and most ornate piece in this exhibition, this jardiniere is a physical representation of the wide array of objects produced to commemorate the centenary of primitive Methodism. These ornate styles reflect the late Victorian era practice of ornamental ceramics, while also indicating the growing respectability of a movement that began on the border of Cheshire and Staffordshire in 1807. Once viewed as radical, primitive Methodism by centenary in 1907 had become an established denomination with a strong sense of heritage. As seen by the textural inscription beneath the MoCOP Folly image, which is replicated across objects in this exhibit, this piece commemorates a successful centenary of ministry begun by Hughbourne and William Clowes. Now, the second identical object on the right side was built in Staffordshire, more specifically Stoke-on-Trent, and they were deeply tied to the primitive Methodist movement. The urban conglomeration was home to the largest and most famous potteries in Britain, and also, as a result, home to a large group of working-class families. A Victorian household was driven by the work that each member completed to support and establish order within their domestic household. Primitive Methodism radicalized this idea by providing opportunities for religious intimacy outside the constraints of Victorian society, to have open worship for everyone who desired a connection with God. It is in these roots that Victorian domestic norms were challenged, so that families who were placed in a life of work and full-time support for their household could experience with others similar to them the grace provided by the primitive Methodist camp meetings. Identical to Object 9 on the leftmost side, this item is another example of embellishment to an object more normally found in a domestic setting. The simple design and representative transferware creates an object of descriptive pictorial identification which laborers would display in their homes to represent their devotion to the primitive Methodist movement. Now on to our last and final row. We start off with a primitive Methodist connection souvenir plate. This large blue plate contrasts with many of the other objects on display. While it displays Hugh Bourne and William Clowes, it also includes the first book steward, James Bourne, who is Hugh Bourne's half-brother, appointed by conference in 1821, as well as the first circuit steward, James Steele, who was appointed July 26, 1811. The inclusion of these two men establishes a larger network of men central to the foundation of primitive Methodism as it spread across 19th century Britain. While all four of these men showcase the beginning and early years of primitive Methodist Church, the great celebrations in 1907 and 1910 were actually the beginning of the end for the primitive Methodism. Despite all effort to create a singular iconographic history of its founders, due to financial pressure, the primitive Methodist Church was eventually forced to combine with the larger Methodist Church in 1932, a reunification over a century after the split caused by the 1807 Mo-Cop camp meeting. Our object in the middle is a Mo-Cop chapel loving cup from 1850 to 1900. This loving cup, with its gilded trim and gently stylized handles, represents one of several variations in objects displayed here that reflect the foundational spirit of primitive Methodism. The simple inscriptions Mo-Cop and chapel seen in the reflection on the other side suggest a mid-Victorian piece. But as it is unmarked, this dating is only tentative. A likely guess that it may perhaps be from the dedication of a new primitive Methodist chapel at Mo-Cop in 1860, a building seen on the previous item, object 12. Loving cups are a category of two-handled cup or jug prominent across the various forms of Methodism in both 18th and 19th century. Their origin arises from the fact that in the 18th century it was illegal for the sacrament to be administered by someone who's not ordained priest in the Church of England. Though John Wesley himself was ordained and his movement grew, more and more meetings were held by the laity. To avoid breaking laws, love feasts or prayer meetings had simple bread and water often used in two-handled cups such as this. The association of the loving cup with the Mo-Cop chapel thus not only recalls the longer history of Methodism dating back to the time of Wesley, but also a reminder of the humble outsider roots of the movement itself. Our final object is very similar to the object on the left, object 12, is another primitive Methodist centenary plate. Similar in ornate decoration and blue and white transfer on object 12, this plate again celebrates the centenary of the primitive Methodist movement. However, in addition to the classic three-way pairing of Mo-Cop, Hugh Bourne, and William Clowes, it also includes several notable chapels. One of the better examples of intricate transferware, this Wood & Sons royal plate was manufactured in Bryson, another one of the large pottery towns in Staffordshire. In clockwise fashion around this plate, starting at the top, transfer images depict the timely progress that the movement had. Starting with its foundation on Mo-Cop Hill in 1807, people began to follow Hugh Bourne and William Clowes as they radicalized Methodist worship for the early Victorian-era working class. 3 chapels built, depicted on the plate, were a product of the movement's growth and a testament to the success that primitive Methodism had. Given this, the plate is a history commemorating object, signifying the celebration of the 1907 primitive Methodist centenary. Examining the reverse of this plate, in this case's mirror, the viewer will see statistics like those seen on object 3. Another testament of pride in the success that primitive Methodists had for the work begun by William Clowes and Hugh Bourne. The founding of the primitive Methodist movement into the Primitive Methodist Church happened in the late 1810 into 1811, when the camp meeting Methodists and the Clowesites merged. These objects all celebrate the beginning of a movement that radicalized Methodism and the ways that the groups practice it. They are all objects that demonstrate the foundation of primitive Methodism and the work of Hugh Bourne and William Clowes in the space of the Mo-Cop camp meeting. Now I'd like to read you a short bit of information regarding the locations of these objects and where they were built. On the leftmost side of the posters, you can see a larger image of the Staffordshire area and the pottery towns that are within it. Is that the same one in here? Different. So, okay. The Ordnance survey that you can see on page 14 of your gallery guide states that this 1769 survey of the County of Staffordshire, done by William Yates and published in 1775, was one of the more accurate maps yet produced of the pottery towns. Highlighted in red, the traditional 6 towns of the potteries were Tunstall, Burslem, Hanley, Stoke, Fenton, and Longton, sites of enormous industrial growth in the coming century. In 1910, these towns were amalgamated to form modern Stoke-on-Trent. The lower map depicts the location of modern Stoke-on-Trent in the United Kingdom with other major cities for reference. On the next page, you can see a map of W.H. Grindley & Co. Pottery Works in Tunstall. Many of the objects on display are from the firm of W.H. Grindley & Co. W.H. Grindley & Co. was founded in 1880 by William Henry Grindley in Tunstall, now a part of modern Stoke-on-Trent. In 1891, the firm moved its production to the Woodland Pottery Works, located between Woodland Street and Williamson Street. This map, done for the Ordnance Survey of 1937, clearly shows the location of woodland pottery, labeled as earthenware on the map, with the great coal-fired bottle oven kilns depicted as circles. The viewer will also note the close location of a Methodist chapel and Sunday school on John Street and Wesley Place near the works, once again demonstrating the close relationship between pottery manufacture and Methodism. W.H. Grindley remained in the hands of William Henry Grindley's descendants until 1960, when it was sold to Alfred Clough Limited. After this, the firm struggled and changed hands several times before going into receivership in 1991. The location of the Pottery Works now is the site of a large Asda brand supermarket. These objects all commemorate and celebrate the beginning of a movement that radicalized Methodism and the ways that groups practice it. They're all objects that demonstrate the foundation of primitive Methodism in the work Hugh Bourne and William Clowes in the space of the Mocop camp meeting. I would love to thank Dr. Kyle Robinson, Levi Berg, and Asher Kenny, who have all assisted in this exhibit in many different ways and who have been supportive of this department project, which allows students to approach thesis styles and a glimpse into the museum and collections study field. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
So if I heard you right, that means that the primitive Methodist movement only lasted between 1807 and 1930-ish?
Yeah, 1932. Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
Yes.
So this 1907 meeting is the one that had the 4,000 people?
Yes.
Okay, and so
Oh.
that
Actually, the 1807, the first meeting,
first one,
had over 4,000 people.
so the 1907 was to commemorate that 18.
Yes. Yeah, and the 1907 meeting was actually held at a junction between Mocop and the Mocop Chapel in Mocop. So,
Does the mocap still exist?
yes, it does. Oh yeah. Yeah. So the Mocop Folly, yes, it does still exist since it was built as a ruin. It was built structurally sound, even though it is ruined.
Preserved by the National Trust now too.
Yes. So
That's called a folly.
yes, a folly is built in
It's a
sense to
double
be.
ruin.
I don't want to stand in the middle of
Yeah,
that,
it's pretty bright.
but
Was it William Clowes who was the dancer?
yes.
Is there any irony in him being a dancer and being a primitive Methodist?
I don't know.
Less of a problem than Americans.
I do find there to be irony in the fact that he was a potter, thus become pottery. So
I know that dancing was strictly forbidden among Methodists, at
yes.
least for much of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Okay, 2 things. I want everybody to make sure they sign your book.
Oh.
Okay, so the primitives were pretty much disparaged by the Methodists, right?
Yes.
Was that because of doctrinal differences or organizational differences?
A mixture of both. In terms of organizational stuff, you weren't allowed to hold a sort of mass service outside of an established church location. And that they're participating out of it is what's brought up a lot of issues within the church, but it is also the sort of the theology that they were practicing, that is what got Hugh Bourne and William Clouse stripped of their ministerial licenses.
There's like a greater emphasis on lay participation
Mhm.
in primitive Methodism. That's what the theological difference Bryson is talking about. Whereas like the Methodist Conference for like so-called Orthodox Wesleyan Methodists in the 19th century, like it's like a top-down organization as opposed to like a bottom-up one. There's also like a big class difference. Primitive Methodists tend to be the people who work in the potteries, and Orthodox Methodists tend to be the people who are the foremen or like close to the owner in the pottery. So there's a bit of like classic Victorian like class stuff, some
But the
Charles
early
Dickens stuff.
Methodists started the camp meetings.
Exactly
too.
right. It's one of these great ironies that Wesley preached outdoors. I was a great fan of it, but a lot of things after Wesley's death, there's of course like the French Revolution and a lot of fear of the mob, and so to like placate the government, the Orthodox Wesleyan Church says, "Oh, we're not going to do that anymore," right? And because there's technically some things that are illegal about mass gatherings. So I'm answering your questions, right?
No, it's okay.
So, so it's like they're Orthodox Methodists are trying to like cozy up to the government, whereas primitive Methodists are like, no, right? Power to the people kind of thing.
Prof. Shepley?
So, kind of going off that and knowing the like the history of like the Church of England going after the Catholics that were in the country because they were
Because they were traitors.
and like
Sit down before I say something else.
I was just inviting myself. But knowing that the Church of England was, not just the Catholics, but like the Puritans
Yeah.
and the Methodists, like what kinds of like sanctions or other like penal things would the Church of England impose against these were then becoming religious minorities?
It's a good question.
Part of that comes down to you can no longer be ordained, and that's like a widespread thing. So we see that with a lot of, especially early Methodists, is you are not allowed to be ordained as a deacon, as a minister.
Right.
You're
That's
stripped of that.
the loving cup substitution for
Mm-hmm.
taking communion.
Right.
That's just, yeah.
Right.
So it's a very minor form of excommunication, but it's still technically
Right.
excommunication.
And Protestants are, because Methodists are of course still Protestant, so they're more generally accepted than are, of course, Catholics. And Methodists can kind of get away with the fact that you can go to the Methodist chapel in the morning and then take communion at a Church of England church in the afternoon and then go back to the chapel at night without really a lot of conflict, because of course Wesley was still an Anglican minister his whole life. Whereas Catholicism, you're not allowed to vote, you're not allowed to like take an oath or serve on a jury until 1826. So in fact there are riots.
Yes.
When they formally allow Catholicism to legally exist in England. They don't like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the benefit to William Clouse and Hugh Bourne was 4 years after the camp meeting, they were officially brought up and constructed a church, like unified.
Which is legal for them
yes.
to do, right?
And so that allowed more sort of freedom to preach and to minister in the ways that they decided to. So,
It's like internal Protestant.
Grant?
So given the lay nature of primitive Methodism, would pottery of this intricacy been available to the working class?
So that's a good question. So as mentioned, and it's in here as well in the gallery guide, the objects on the second shelf, leftmost side, objects 6, the tea service group, they built objects in a way in which they would be more available to working class and lay class people, more affordable, instead of very ornate busts or plates or these jasperware miniatures on this rightmost side. So a bit of in between, a bit of possible profit in it, and a bit of service to the working class.
I think, so the question I have is, so I see all these plates, and I see these buses, and I see the iconography. And so if you could help me get more like historical Methodist context on using iconography, people's images on plates and stuff like that, and selling those at big events, Or is this something, I guess maybe a question I would have, that's because it was a more minority movement? So they really focus on the two people who helped to start it there. Yeah.
Yeah. So most likely would focus on the minority movement and the two people who started it. As seen in most of these, in almost all of these objects, they strictly just display the Mocop Castle, William Klaus and Hugh Bourne. And since this era, since Mocop was within the Stoke-on-Trent era, the largest producers of pottery in England at the time, a lot of the working class was familiar with it, familiar with the work they were doing, familiar with what was going on in the area. And so it was more than likely driven towards just representation, but also possible profitable outcomes in it. So, but a lot of these objects would be displayed, not commonly used. We speculate that the jardiniere probably had dirt in it at some point. So, for flowers, Jackson.
Was there any like abrasiveness between the prior Methodist movement before the split and the primitive Methodists' use of iconography and all other things?
I don't know.
Yeah, there's kind of like a war of the image
Yeah.
in a way.
That's a good way to say it.
Yeah.
I mean, your previous exhibit kind of.
Right, was sort of, there was Adam Clark, who was like an Orthodox Methodist, and on all of those, they say Adam Clark, Wesleyan Methodist, right?
Mhm.
So they're like very clear about the difference. But I think that's maybe back to that earlier question too about like the icon. Maybe it's this like technically against some Ten Commandment